Acting President, the area I'd like to focus on today is the substantive part of the bill which relates to amendments to the Firearms Act. And there are around 230,000 licensed firearm licence holders in Victoria. So it's a substantial number of people in Victoria hold firearms licences, and they hold them for the purposes of work in agriculture and primary production. They hold them for the purposes of professional hunting and pest control activities, and they also hold them, the vast majority hold them, for recreational shooting and hunting activities. And recreational shooting and hunting in Victoria is a great outdoor activity. It's enjoyed, as I said, by hundreds of thousands of Victorians, whether it's clay target shooting, which is more art than science, whether it's target shooting on a rifle range, which is more science than art, and whether it's hunting. They're great outdoor activities. They're activities which are enjoyed often in a social setting. They bring people together, and they're a great leveller. In terms of hunting, in terms of recreational shooting, anyone can participate, whether they're men or women, whether they're young or old, disabled people, able-bodied people, can all participate. And in terms of competition, clay target shooting, rifle shooting, competition is a great leveller as well, because you can have a young, lightly built teenager competing against an older, very experienced person, big, solid person, and they can compete and they can win. Male or female can compete against each other in a competitive way, and either can win. So it's a great leveller in terms of competition, and it's also a great leveller in bringing people together. The people who participate in recreational shooting come from all walks of life. And I've had the pleasure of shooting with people who work as tradesmen, who work as labourers, people who are in primary production, farmers, people who work, the Attorney General, people who work in the legal profession, people who work in business. I've even been shooting with a Supreme Court judge. So people from all walks of life participate in recreational shooting in its various forms, and they are overwhelmingly law-abiding people. Overwhelmingly in their use of firearms are they law-abiding people, and overwhelmingly in their general life are they law-abiding people. And it's very interesting, Acting President, to reflect on the level of criminal activity reported in Victoria. And in 2019-20, the Crime Statistics Agency reported that there were some 408,000 offences reported across the full spectrum in this state in that year. Yet, according to the Victoria Police Annual Report, in relation to the Firearms Act, there were all of 80 offences recorded in the same year. So out of 408,000 offences, only 80 of them related to the Firearms Act, less than 0.02%, which reflects, as I said, overwhelmingly people who hold firearms licences in this state, law-abiding people, are good people. And all of them are actively involved with peak bodies. By virtue of the genuine reason requirements of the Firearms Act, everyone that holds, in a recreational context, who holds a firearms licence is also a member of one of the membership bodies, one of the peak bodies, whether it's Field and Game Australia, whether it's Sporting Shooters Association of Australia, the Australian Deer Association, all of which I've had the pleasure of being associated with, all of which are very professional in their outlook, are very committed to the responsible use of firearms in this state. Likewise, the Shooting Industry Foundation of Australia, which supports and works with the professional side of the industry in terms of firearm wholesalers and dealers. Now, I'd like to turn, Acting President, to Part 5 of the bill, which is the amendments to the Firearms Act. And there are a number of amendments which are made to this bill, which I will go through in passing now, and we have a number of matters that we'll raise in committee when the bill reaches committee. The first amendment that the bill makes is in Clause 9 of Part 5, which seeks to insert a new subsection 3C in the Firearms Act. And the purpose of new subsection 3C will be to provide a basis to allow the Chief Commissioner, where a decision has been made to reclassify a firearm. It's under the Firearms Act. Firearms are categorised based on their type, in some cases based on their appearance, into one of a number of different categories. A to B, A and B are the lowest, C, D and E are higher categories, and H for handguns is a separate category again. From time to time, the Chief Commissioner may elect to reclassify a firearm, raise its classification from a lower level to a higher level, and the purpose of inserting proposed section 3C into the Act will be to allow the Chief Commissioner, where he determines to reclassify a firearm, allow him to allow a person who held a firearm under an existing licence to continue to hold that firearm under that licence, notwithstanding the fact that the firearm has been classified to a higher level. And that capacity, that grandfathered capacity to hold the firearm under the existing licence will exist until the firearm is disposed of or the person's licence expires, etc. And we think that's a reasonable provision that recognises that people who have held particular firearms under particular licences reasonably should be able to retain or have the capacity to retain those under the existing licence, notwithstanding reclassification for new licence holders. Clauses 10 to 16 of the bill make interesting change with respect to proof of identity. Someone applying for a firearms licence or becoming a firearms dealer or doing a number of other things, seeking a number of other permissions or recognitions under the Firearms Act, is required to provide evidence of identity to the Chief Commissioner. And interestingly, the current Act requires that identity documentation be provided consistent with that required by the Commonwealth Financial Transactions Act. And this is the Act which, under Commonwealth law, requires people to have 100 points of identification when opening a bank account. It's something that's well known to all members of the community, that requirement for 100 points of identification. And the Firearms Act currently requires that same standard of identification. Interestingly, the bill before us tonight, in a number of clauses of the Act, seeks to replace that standard with one which states identity of the person in a form approved by the Chief Commissioner. And that's one of the issues we'll seek to explore in committee, the reason for the shift from the current well-recognised requirement of the Financial Transactions Act, the 100 points, to a new requirement to the satisfaction or in the form approved by the Chief Commissioner. Clause 17 of the bill makes a change with respect to the disposal of firearms by a licensed firearm dealer. The current requirement, Section 94 of the Firearms Act, is that a dealer cannot dispose of a firearm to a person unless they are reasonably satisfied that the person holds a firearms licence. In short, that they're reasonably satisfied, and there are certain exemptions around that. But the basic requirement is the dealer needs to be satisfied before they sell a firearm that the person they're selling it to holds a firearms licence. Interestingly, this bill will change that requirement from the dealer being reasonably satisfied, having a reasonable belief that they hold a licence, to a requirement that they must cite the licence. Now, in practice, this is not likely to be a significant change. I would think there'd be few circumstances in which a firearms dealer would sell a firearm without requiring the purchaser to produce a licence or evidence of the exemption. But the way the provision is structured does raise some questions around how it interacts with the current provisions of the of the Act. So we'll seek to get some clarification on that when the bill goes into committee. Clauses 18 and 19 of the bill are interesting. They seek to impose new requirements with respect to the hiring and lending of firearms. Now, it is a long-standing practice, and the current Firearms Act provides for licensed firearm dealers to lend and hire firearms to firearm licence holders. And this is something which occurs from time to time. A primary producer may have a need to, because of a fire or something, may have a need to destroy stock and may need to borrow a firearm for the purpose of doing that. Someone may be seeking to purchase a new firearm and want to trial it at a range or at a ground before they purchase it. So it's quite common for firearm dealers to lend or hire firearms to licence holders. The bill seeks to insert new provisions with respect to restricting the way in which firearms can be loaned or hired by seeking to insert a new provision that the loan of a firearm must not exceed 30 days, and that can then be extended for a further 30 days provided an application is made in writing. Now, the government has not provided justification for this change in requirement. In fact, the government has, in the briefing with the department, clarified that there's nothing in this provision that would prevent a person having loaned a firearm or borrowed a firearm for 30 days, having had a 30-day extension, then returning the firearm and borrowing it again. So this is really a paper exercise. It adds to the administrative burden for firearms dealers, most of whom are small businesses, and it doesn't add any value to the firearms framework. So when the bill reaches committee, we'll be seeking to omit clauses 18 and 19, which are the clauses that impose this new paperwork without providing any tangible reason to do so. Clause 20 of the bill is also an interesting one, and it relates to a new requirement with respect to firearms dealers sending firearms or parts to other firearms dealers. And basically, the bill seeks to create a new requirement that where a firearm is sent by post within Victoria or outside Victoria by a Victorian dealer interstate or by an interstate dealer into Victoria, that the firearm must not be labelled in a way that identifies it as a firearm, and that it must be received, transmitted in a way that's tracked electronically, and also received by the licensed firearm dealer to who the package is sent. Now that raises a number of issues as to the practicality of how that's going to work, as to who is going to be responsible for actually receiving a package, and what in fact it means for a package not to be labelled in a way that identifies the contents of the package. Given that firearms being transmitted, being sent by post or courier service are going to be long, thin packages, typically from firearms dealer A addressed to firearms dealer B. So whether that gives rise to the fact that it's identified as a firearm is something that needs to be clarified in the committee stage. And I might add, Acting President, the issue of the sending of firearms or the transport of firearms is one that's been quite problematic for the firearms industry in Australia recently, with FedEx TNT making the decision to withdraw from the carriage of firearms in Australia. And this has had a major negative impact on firearms dealers in Australia, dealers seeking to transfer firearms to customers, seeking to transfer firearms to other dealers and transact with wholesalers. And I have to say, frankly, Acting President, that decision by FedEx TNT is something they wouldn't do in their home country, the United States. There is no way known FedEx would withdraw from the transport of firearms in the United States, and it's outrageous that they have taken that decision to do that here in Australia, thereby undermining the operation of particularly regional firearms dealers in this country and indeed in this state. The next section of the bill, Acting President, comes to the issue of firearms prohibition orders. Firearms prohibition orders were first put in place by this Parliament in 2018. And despite, despite the name Firearms Prohibition Orders, these orders are in fact something that can be applied to any person, whether they are a firearms licence holder or whether they've never had anything to do with firearms. They're orders which allow senior police, which can be imposed by senior police, which prohibit a person from having any contact or involvement with firearms. They do prohibit a person from going to any premises where firearms may be stored, and they also invoke prohibitions on coming into contact with certain people, and they provide Victoria Police with the right to stop and search without cause any person who is the subject of a firearm prohibition order and any people who may be with the person who is the subject of a firearm prohibition order, including the vehicles, vessels, aircraft that such a person may be in. So these are very powerful orders. The intention when they were created in 2018 was that they would be used only on the worst of the worst. And as I said, notwithstanding the name, they don't necessarily have anything to do with firearms, and they can be imposed on people who are believed to be involved in organised crime or outlaw motorcycle gangs, whether they've had any involvement with firearms, whether they've ever had a firearms licence or not. But they are very powerful orders, and when that legislation was created in 2018, it was with the understanding that they would be applied very carefully, that they would be applied by police officers at a senior level, and at that point the coalition parties sought to restrict the application of FPOs to officers of the rank of Assistant Commissioner and above. The Act, or the Bill now Act, provided for them to be issued by superintendents and above. Because of the gravity of them and the severity of them, it was our view they should be applied only at the rank of Assistant Commissioner and above. We know from Victoria Police annual report last year that in 1920 some 231 firearm prohibition orders were issued, and at the 30th of June last year 381 were in place. In that same financial year, some 296 searches had been carried out pursuant to firearm prohibition orders on people and associates of people to whom those orders have been issued. In the briefing that was provided for this bill on the 21st of September, an update was provided insofar as indicating there are now some 1,111 firearm prohibition orders in place. So there's been a substantial increase between 30 June of last year and September of this year in the issue of those orders. Now, notwithstanding some commentary around the way in which those orders apply and the criteria for those orders applying, this bill doesn't seek to change that criteria. What it does do is seek to impose a new requirement that arises from a recommendation of Legal and Social Issues Committee of the Legislative Council with respect to obliging someone who is subject to a firearm prohibition order to notify a change of address, curiously within 24 hours of making that change of address. And I've looked at other legislation, Acting President. There are, and I have yet to find another piece of legislation which requires a change of address to be notified within 24 hours. And that gives rise to a number of questions around when exactly have you changed your address in order to determine whether it's 24 hours has elapsed in giving notification. And that's something that I'll seek to get some clarification from the Minister when this bill goes into committee. The other provision with respect to FPOs that is changed is the level of delegation required to issue them. As I indicated, Acting President, when the Act was first put in place, the provision was first put in place, it provided for superintendent and above to issue FPOs. The bill now seeks to extend that delegation to some officers of the rank of Inspector and above working in certain areas of Victoria Police. And the impact of that is something that we also will seek to explore with the Minister in committee. The other changes the bill makes are to the disclosure in clause 23, the disclosure of handgun target shooting activity. People who hold handguns are required to participate in organised club shoots on a certain number of occasions in a year, and those clubs are required to advise Victoria Police, the Chief Commissioner, of who has participated in those shoots. And the bill makes a curious change to the requirement to notify the Chief Commissioner, and the reason for that is something else that we will seek clarification from in the committee stage. The final change the bill makes with respect to firearms is in relation to the storage of firearms. Schedule 4 of the Firearms Act sets out the requirements for storage of firearms based on their category. Category A and B, lowest level of firearm, basically currently require that the firearm be stored in a steel or hardwood container. It's the intention of the bill to change that requirement from a steel or hardwood container which is not easily penetrable, I think is the word in the current Act, to one which specifies that it must be steel storage of a thickness of at least 1.6 millimetre that complies with Australian Standard 1594, which is a standard for steel, and then replicates largely the existing provisions of the Act. My understanding is that's something which was considered by the Firearms Consultative Committee, which is made up of the peak bodies in the shooting sector, and no opposition to that was raised, but the detail of that, why the government has elected to go with 1.6 millimetres thickness rather than 1.5, for example, or 1.8, how that sits with existing safes, storage safes which are commercially available, is also something that we will seek to explore in committee. So, Acting President, the Coalition does not oppose this bill. The changes it makes to the Firearms Act are largely administrative. We do note, though, that there are a number which will increase regulatory burden without any obvious discernible benefit. The example of the provisions with loaning and hiring firearms, which we will not support. Also the provisions with respect to the sending of firearms also add regulatory burden, add red tape, but don't add a lot of value to firearm licensing. So with those words, the Coalition won't oppose this bill, but we look forward to exploring a number of these issues with the Minister in committee.